Hi there, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's April 3rd. Today we celebrate the birthday of a Russian count who funded an expedition that led to the discovery of the California poppy. We'll also learn about one of the country's most beloved naturalists. We celebrate the life of the second woman to be professionally employed as a botanist in the United States. She died 100 years ago today. We also celebrate a nurseryman whose passion for plants was sparked by the gift of a fuchsia. Today's unearthed words feature words about rainy, windy April. We grow that garden library with a book about a little cottage that you just might find inspiring as you spruce up your own nest this season. And then finally, we'll wrap things up with a little poem about trillium, which are also known as wake robin. But first, let's catch up on some greetings from gardeners around the world and today's curated news. Today we'll kick things off with a greeting from Marie Jacobs, who wishes her grandmother a happy 86th birthday. She says, "I learned to garden from my grandmother, and she also taught me how to appreciate native plants." Aw, good grandmother. Happy birthday. Then Beth in Wisconsin wrote to remind us to harvest fiddleheads. If you have ferns, you'll have fiddleheads. Fiddleheads are a sure sign of spring, and harvesting fiddlehead ferns is nothing more than cutting off the little furled fronds of a young fern, and you basically cut them off when they're about an inch or two above the ground, and you eat them like a vegetable. Now, most people think that fiddlehead ferns taste like a cross between asparagus and young, tender spinach. And some people can even detect flavors of mushroom or artichoke when they're eating fiddlehead ferns. Now, if you're wondering how to eat them, just know that you should never eat them raw. Fiddleheads need to be cooked, otherwise they're quite bitter, and they also contain trace amounts of a toxin, so you definitely want to cook them. But cooking them is a snap. It only takes about 5 minutes. And all you have to do is prepare them by rinsing them in water, rub off any of the papery brown skin, and then they're ready to be cooked. You can steam them, sauté them, roast, braise, or pickle them. But I find it's best not to get too fancy and simply prepare them as you would asparagus. Personally, I like to sauté my fiddleheads in butter. I add some scallions, garlic, and mushrooms. And then I usually add that to a light salad, or you can just eat it on its own as a side. But the main thing is to be on the lookout for them now, because you can't harvest them once they've unfurled. The key is to catch them when they're small, when they're just curling out of the ground. And in our northern climate gardens here in the upper Midwest, that usually means we have to do most of our harvesting by the middle of May. So hop to it, go out and check where your fiddlehead ferns are, see how they're progressing. You might be surprised. They might already be popping out of the ground. We've had a few warm days here the last week or so, and that trend looks like it's going to be continuing. So they actually might be popping out a little bit earlier this year than they have in previous years. So check it out. Harvest some fiddlehead ferns. Bon appetit. And then finally, I received an email from Robert Jost, who sent a picture of his grandson holding a dandelion, and the taproot is almost 3 feet long. He writes, "I was checking out my spring garden and saw this dandelion, and when I pulled it out, I couldn't believe the taproot. Check it out. Wow." Well, wow is right, Robert. I think you win the prize for getting out to your garden. You already did some weeding, so you're off to a great start. And what a memorable experience for your grandson. I love it. He's holding this dandelion up, and the taproot is almost as tall as he is. Very sweet. If you'd like to participate in the Gardener Greeting segment, just send your garden pics, stories, birthday wishes, and so forth to Jennifer at thedailygardener.org. That's Jennifer at thedailygardener.org. And if you're used to listening to the podcast on your phone or in your car while you are driving to work, and obviously times have changed and we're listening at home, there's an easy way to do that. Just ask Alexa or Google to play the Daily Gardener podcast. It's just that easy. Give it a try. Here's today's curated article. Today's article is a post that was written by Lisa Myers, and her post is called Gardening for Resilience. Lisa writes, "If you've ever tried to grow a garden, you'll know that your first efforts are seldom as successful as you'd hope. Conditions can be less than ideal, and you can mess up simple things. Even the experts do. But there are ways to approach gardening that will improve your ability to weather common mistakes." Lisa gives us many tips, but among them are these. First, she points out that good soil is crucial. And I love what she says here. She says, dirt is dirt, right? Sadly, no. If I had to do it all over again, I'd have spent that first year amending my soil. A lot of gardeners say that. So get going on a compost pile, and if you can, get some compost delivered to your house. Then next she says, choose some plants for quick wins. And what she says here is exactly what I'm doing here at the cabin. She says, grab something quick like an herb garden, a planted lettuce bowl, or even a strawberry planter so you can get those first nibbles right away. She says there's a psychological factor to getting an immediate reward that'll help you be more resilient in the face of inevitable garden setbacks. And that is so true. And if you have little kids, you should consider starting them in the garden with radish. Radish are a great first crop for little kids because they grow so quickly. Plus, little kids generally like the taste of radish. And then finally, here are two other tips from Lisa that I thought were very helpful. First, look for what grows well in your area. If you don't know, ask your neighbors. Send them an email, jump on the Nextdoor app, ask your neighbors there. Just find out about the crops that grow well in your area, in your town, in your neighborhood, in your city. And then last but not least, grow plants you love to eat. I've talked about this very topic a lot over the past few years. Sometimes when we're growing edibles, what we're really doing is experimenting. Many gardeners grow edibles and then say they never get around to eating them, or they had no intention of eating them. They were essentially growing them for sport. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except for right now with seeds in such high demand. And with so much going on, I think you'll be better off if you just grow things that you know you'll eat, so you don't waste your precious time and money. And I love how Lisa ends her article. She writes, I hope that more people take up gardening as a means of self-care. And I also hope that if my advice can make early gardening experiences more enjoyable, that more people will become gardeners and experience a real lifestyle change rather than a stopgap measure. And she finishes the article with this. I want you to love working with plants as much as I do. So there you go. Great advice from Lisa. And before I close this segment, I have a little piece of advice for you as well. If you happen to have a magnifying glass laying around the house, track it down and add it to your garden tote. The best gardeners throughout our history have looked closely at their plants, and they often used magnifiers of some fashion. So this season, get up close and personal with your plants and increase your intimacy with your garden by looking at it through the lens of a magnifying glass. Now's the perfect time to add one to your garden tote. And as with every garden tool, you won't use it if it's not handy. So find it and put it in your tote. All right, that's it for today's gardening news. Now, if you'd like to check out my curated news articles and blog posts for yourself, you're in luck, because I share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group for the show. It's called the Daily Gardener Community, and there's no need to take notes or search for links because it's all right there. So the next time you're on Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. Today is the birthday of a man who was the foreign minister of Russia, Count Nikolay Rumantsev, who was born on this day in 1754. In 1815, Nikolay funded the round-the-world scientific voyage of the Rurik, which included the poet and botanist Adalbert von Chamisso and a doctor-surgeon named Johann Friedrich von Escholz. 2 years later, in 1817, the Rurik ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it had planned to reprovision. During their stay in San Francisco, which lasted about a month, Chamisso discovered the California poppy, which he named Escholzia californica, after his friend Johann Friedrich Escholz. A century later, in 1903, the botanist Sarah Plummer Lemon put forth a successful piece of legislation that nominated the golden poppy, Escholzia californica, as the state flower of California. And here's what the botanist Alice Eastwood once said about the California poppy. The Escholzia so glows with the sunbeams caught in its chalice that it diffuses light upon the other flowers and the grass. This poppy will not shine unless the sun beams on it. Otherwise, it folds itself up and goes to sleep. And today is the birthday of the naturalist, poet, and philosopher John Burroughs, who was born on a dairy farm in Roxbury, outside of Boston, on this day in 1837. When Burroughs attended school, his desk was next to that of the Erie Railroad robber baron Jay Gould, who was the son of a nearby neighbor. When Burroughs struggled in school, Gould would bail him out. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. Called John O'Birds for his special admiration for birds, Burroughs loved the natural world. He was one of the 4 vagabonds, a reference to an annual camping group that included Harvey Firestone, Henry Ford, and Teddy Roosevelt. And Burroughs drove a Ford, which was an annual present from his friend Henry. John Burroughs wrote about what he knew and loved best, the land around his home in the Catskills of upstate New York. The area included a stream called the Papacton, and today it's known as the East Branch of the Delaware River. Burroughs was great friends with Walt Whitman, who he loved dearly. Of Whitman, Burroughs wrote, "Meeting Walt was the most important event of my life. I expanded under his influence because of his fine liberality and humanity on all subjects. And here's a fun fact about John Burroughs. Whitman gave him a little marketing advice for his very first book called Wake Robin. Burroughs recalled, "It's difficult to hit upon suitable titles for books. And when I went to Walt with Wake Robin and several other names written on paper, he asked, 'What does Wake Robin mean?' 'It's a spring flower,' I replied. 'Then that is exactly the name you want,' he told me." Here's the beginning of that book called Wake Robin by John Burroughs. Spring in our northern climate may fairly be said to extend from the middle of March to the middle of June. It is this period that marks the return of the birds. Each stage of the advancing season gives prominence to certain species as to certain flowers. The dandelion tells me when to look for the swallow, the dogtooth violet when to expect the wood thrush, and when I have found the wake robin in bloom, I know the season is fairly inaugurated. With me, this flower is associated not merely with the awakening of Robin, for he has been awake for some weeks, but with the universal awakening and the rehabilitation of nature. Wake Robin is the common name for trillium. Trilliums are in the lily family, and they carpet the forest floor in springtime. They have a single, large, white, long-lasting flower that turns pink as it matures. And there's one little memorable fact about trilliums. Most parts of the trillium occur in threes. There are 3 broad, flat leaves, 3 petals to a flower, and 3 sepals. The part that encloses the petals protects them in bud and supports them in bloom. During Burroughs' time, the Tennessean and other newspapers used to advertise English Wake Robin pills. The ads said they were the best liver and cathartic pills in use, and they were 25 cents per box. John Burroughs died at the age of 84. He'd been traveling on his way back to the Catskills after undergoing abdominal surgery in California. Burroughs just wanted to see his home one more time, and both his nurse and his biographer were with him as he made the trip by train. After a restless attempt at sleep, he asked, "How near home are we?" When he was told the train was crossing Ohio, he slumped back and passed away. In 1937, on the 100th anniversary of John Burroughs' birthday, a celebration was held at Hartwick College in New York. Music was furnished by the college a cappella choir, who sang Burroughs' favorite song, Lullaby, by Brahms. And the Supreme Court Justice Abraham Kellogg presented this tribute. When the trees begin to leaf and the birds are here, when the arbutus, laurel, and wildflowers are blooming, and nature is clothing herself with beauty and grandeur, turn ye to your library, and in a restful attitude read Pepacton by Burroughs, and you will acquaint yourself as never before with John Burroughs, the scientist, the naturalist, the poet, and the philosopher. And it was John Burroughs who said, "Most young people find botany a dull study. So it is, as talk from the textbooks in schools. But study by yourself in the fields and woods, and you will find it a source of perennial delight." Today is the anniversary of the death of the botanist Kate Brandegee, who died on this day in 1920. Kate was the third woman to enroll at Berkeley's medical school, and she was the second woman to be professionally employed as a botanist in the United States. After getting her MD at Berkeley, Kate found that starting a medical practice seemed too daunting. Thankfully, her passion for botany had been ignited during med school, and she had learned that plants were the primary sources of medicine. So she dropped the mantle of physician and pursued botany. 5 years later, she became the curator of the San Francisco Academy of Sciences Herbarium. And while she was at the Academy, she personally trained Alice Eastwood. Later, when Kate moved on, Alice was ready to take her place. Kate had been a phenomenal mentor. Now, during her time at the Academy, in a surprise development at the age of 40, Kate had fallen insanely in love with a plantsman named Townsend Brandegee. Equally yoked, their honeymoon was a 500-mile nature walk, collecting plant specimens from San Diego to San Francisco. The couple moved to San Diego, where they created a herbarium that was praised as a botanical paradise. Their collecting trips, often taken together, but sometimes individually, would be their lifelong passion, and they traveled through much of California, Arizona, and Mexico. At times, they used the free railroad passes that were given to botanists. And even when Kate was in poor health, she loved these experiences. In 1908, at the age of 64, she wrote Townsend a letter, and she said, "I am going to walk from Placerville to Truckee," which was 52 miles. In 1906, when the Berkeley Herbarium was destroyed by the big earthquake, the Brandegees single-handedly restored it by giving the school their entire botanical library, including many rare volumes, and their entire plant collection as well, which numbered some 80,000 plants. Thanks to Townsend's large inheritance, the couple was financially independent, but they were also exceptionally selfless. The Brandegees followed their plants and books back to Berkeley, where Townsend and Kate worked the rest of their lives for free. The botanist Marcus Jones said of Kate, "She was the one botanist competent to publish a real book about the native plants of California." But sadly, Kate had delayed writing this work. She was 75 when she fell on the university grounds at Berkeley, and she broke her shoulder. 3 weeks later, she died on this day in 1920. And on a happier note, today is the birthday of Graham Stewart Thomas, who was born on this day in 1909. Graham Stewart Thomas was fundamentally a nurseryman, and he lived a life fully immersed in the garden. His passion was sparked at a young age by a special birthday present that he was given when he turned 6. It was a beautiful potted fuchsia. In 2003, Graham's gardening outfit, which included his pants, vest, and shoes, as well as a variety of his tools like plant markers and a watering can, were donated to England's Garden Museum. Graham Stewart Thomas was best known for his work with garden roses and his leadership of over 100 National Trust gardens. He wrote 19 books on gardening, and he was known as a purposeful perfectionist. He never wasted a minute. As for his legacy, you might be wondering what folks have to say about Graham Stewart Thomas on social media. Well, here's a sampling. Pachysandra ground cover, a Graham Stewart Thomas classic. My mom gave me a Graham Stewart Thomas for my first gardening book. So very special. Here's one I love. It's from a nursery. Our best-selling plant of 2015, at number 1, drumroll please, Eryngium, Graham Stewart Thomas. Here's one from a designer. Flower spike on yucca in border. Graham Stewart Thomas used them as punctuation marks in design. And then finally, here's my favorite one. Love being married to someone who knows what I mean when I say, bring me Graham Stewart Thomas, which of course is code for roses. In Unearthed Words, here are some words about April, cold and windy. This first one's from the American essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. April cold with dripping rain, willows and lilacs bring again the whistle of returning birds and trumpet lowing of the herds. And here's one from the American poet and teacher Dora Hill Reed Goodale. Oh, how fresh the wind is blowing. See, the sky is bright and clear. Oh, how green the grass is growing. April, April, are you here? And finally, here's a poem called The Sensitive Plant from the English Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. A sensitive plant in a garden grew, and the young winds fed it with silver dew. And it opened its fan-like leaves to the light and closed them beneath the kisses of night. The snowdrop and then the violet arose from the ground with a warm rain wet. Then the pied windflowers and the tulip tall and narcissi, the fairest among them all. And the hyacinth purple and white and blue, which flung from its bells a sweet peal anew, and the jessamine faint, and the sweet tuberose, the sweetest flower for scent that blows. And all rare blossoms from every clime grew in that garden in perfect prime. And the sinuous path of lawn and of moss, which led through the garden, along and across, some open at once to the sun and the breeze, some lost among bowers of blossoming trees. The plumed insects, swift and free, like golden boats on a sunny sea, laden with light and odor, which pass over the gleam of the living grass. And spring arose on the garden fair, like the spirit of love felt everywhere, and each flower and herb on earth's dark breast rose from the dreams of its wintry rest. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Bee Cottage by Frances Schultz. This lighthearted book came out in 2015, and the subtitle is How I Made a Muddle of Things and Decorated My Way Back to Happiness. This book was inspired by Frances's popular House Beautiful magazine series on the makeover of her East Hampton house that she calls Bee Cottage. Frances had intended this book to be a decorating book, but it evolved into so much more. It's a memoir combining both beautiful photos of Bee Cottage inside and out and a compelling personal story, Frances's story. This book is perfect for this time of year when we're trying to come up with all kinds of ideas for our home and garden. In this book, Frances shares what she learned during her renovations of Bee Cottage. We get a sneak peek into how she decided each area in the house and garden would be used and furnished. From a personal standpoint, Frances came to discover that, like decorating a home or planting a garden, our lives must adapt to who we are and what we need at different points along the way. And I love this little poem that Frances starts her book out with, along with a picture of one of her garden gates. It's got the cutout of a little bee on top of it. He who loves an old house never loves in vain. How can an old house used to sun and rain, to lilac and to larkspur and an elm above, ever fail to answer the heart that gives it love? So sweet. Then Frances shows a picture of Bee Cottage. She says before it became Bee Cottage, it was a little run down and it had curb appeal, but not much love. And she wrote, I felt a bit that way myself. And here's how the story of Bee Cottage starts. Frances writes, I'd planned to make Bee Cottage the perfect place to begin my second marriage. I'd bought it with my fiancé's blessing. It was great for us and for his 2 sons. And though the house was old and needed work, I relished the prospect. If only I'd been as optimistic about the marriage. But the story of Bee Cottage begins, I'm sorry to say, with heartbreak. After the wedding invitations were sent, after gifts received, after the ridiculously expensive dress made, after deposits paid, after a house bought, I called it off. I wish I could say he was a jerk and a cad, but he wasn't. He was and is a great guy. The relationship failed because we just were not a fit. And there I was, with a house and the dawning that everything I had dreamed it would now be something else entirely. And that is the beginning of the Bee Cottage story. This is a great, lighthearted book. If you're looking for a nice escape from the heaviness of this time that we're living through, this book would be a great choice. It's lovely. Now, you can get a used copy of The Bee Cottage Story by Frances Schultz and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for under $4. Great deal. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. In researching John Burroughs for today's show and his first book, Wake Robin, I found a little-known poem by a woman named Rebecca Salisbury Palfrey Utter, and the poem is called Wake Robin. I love the poem so much I decided to learn a little bit more about Rebecca for myself. It turns out she was a descendant of Jean Williams Palfrey, who served with George Washington and was an ambassador to France. And when Rebecca was 28 years old, she became the wife of a Chicago minister named David Utter. Thereafter, she worked beside her husband as a missionary, and it was Rebecca Utter who coined the now popular term Daughter of the King in one of her more popular poems. But today I thought I'd share Rebecca's poem called The Wake Robin, which of course is a common name for the trillium. Here it is. When leaves green and hardy from sleep have just uncurled, spring is so tardy in this part of the world. There comes a white flower forth, opens its eyes, looks out upon the earth in drowsy surprise. A fair and pleasant vision the nodding blossoms make. and the flower's name and mission is Wake, Robin, wake. But you're late, my lady. You have not earned your name. Robin's up already, long before you came. You trusted the sun's glances to rouse you from your naps, and the brook that near you dances, at spring's approach perhaps. Your chamber was too shady, the drooping trees among. Robin's up already. Don't you hear his song? There he sits, swinging in his brown and scarlet cloak, his notes like laughter ringing. 'Tis plain he sees the joke. Accidents will happen, laughs Robin loud and clear. If you think to catch me napping, wake earlier next year. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. During the COVID-19 pandemic, The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Wyoming, Minnesota. You can find today's show notes over at thedailygardener.org. That's thedailygardener.org. And to participate in the Gardener Greetings segment, send your garden pics, stories, birthday wishes, and so forth to Jennifer at thedailygardener.org. And to listen to the show while you're at home, just ask Alexa or Google to play the Daily Gardener podcast. It's that easy. You can find the Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media, and don't forget to share the show with all your garden friends. Finally, I want to thank my fabulous behind-the-scenes team of Brooke, Kiana, and Paige, and my editor, Eric Begay. Have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.